Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
Every year, my family made a big production out of what they called the annual photo, the one that ended up on mantles and Christmas cards and in frames that sat like little trophies of togetherness. And every year I did the same tired little dance with myself where I waited for the text, told myself not to care, told myself that maybe this time they would remember that I exist. Then watched the picture show up online without me while everyone wrote the same comments about tradition and love and how blessed they were, and this year the routine broke in the smallest and loudest way because there was not even the courtesy of a group text to ignore. I wish I could tell you it surprised me, but the truth is it felt like the final turn of a key they had been twisting for years, a tidy confirmation that I was not missing the message anymore because the message was me. And when I stared at that glossy grid of smiling faces with the caption about family being forever, I was not angry first. I was tired in that bone-deep way you get when you have spent too long pretending something hurts less than it does. And the tiredness made room for a kind of quiet that people confuse for strength. It started long before the photos because there were always little rules I only learned after I broke them, like how my mother, Elaine, kept a running mental list of who qualifies as family based on who she is currently proud of, and my father, Rick, plays the reasonable mediator who shrugs and says it is better not to stir things up, and my sister, Megan, is the one who tells me I am too sensitive while she schedules girls-only brunches for every female relative except me and my brother. Tyler is the charmer who can forget birthdays and still be the golden child because he writes long captions about gratitude that sound like he is auditioning for a sponsored post. There were years when I still drove over with a pie and a smile because hope is stubborn even when experience is consistent, and I stood on porches where no one opened the door because the group chat apparently decided to move the time earlier and forgot to tell me. And I sat through dinners where every toast circled around the college acceptances and job promotions and engagement rings that belonged to other people while my own news became the conversation break where someone refilled water. And I would leave with that fizzy mix of shame and fury that makes you promise yourself you will stop chasing people who never turn around. This year I had done the mature thing and made different plans for the day because pretending not to wait is the only way to keep from waiting, so I kept busy. I put my phone on the counter face down like it was a pet I was training. And when I finally picked it up after a long stretch of pointed busywork, there was nothing on the screen except a marketing email and a reminder from a bill I was already paying, which somehow hit harder than a direct snub because it meant the snub had become muscle memory for them, a habit that did not require discussion. I opened the platform we all use even though everyone claims to hate it, and there it was. The photo with the caption about another year and how lucky they are to be together. And I saw Grandma Rose front and center with that satisfied look she gives when the room is arranged exactly as she wants it, and I noticed something I had never noticed before because I had never let myself look long enough, which was that I had not been cropped out or accidentally missed. I had been edited from the story long ago, the way you remove a contact you no longer call, and the family had learned to see that as normal. I thought about calling my mother because there is always that reflex where you go back to the original source, like maybe the person who wounded you can also stitch you up, but I pictured that soft tone she uses when she wants to be kind while being cruel. The one where she says she hates drama and wishes I would not make people uncomfortable, and I could feel my throat prepare to apologize for the millionth time for being the kind of person who says out loud that something hurts, and I put the phone down because I am finally done giving people a chance to call my pain inconvenient. The thing no one tells you about being cast as the difficult one is that the role comes with a strange freedom the moment you stop auditioning. Because the minute I accepted that I was not invited, I could also accept that I did not owe anyone a performance of grace that makes their life easier. And once that thought settled and I felt the spark of something sharper and cleaner than rage, which is the urge to set a boundary in a way that cannot be ignored or retold as an overreaction. So I clicked into the comments where the usual suspects were performing gratitude, and I wrote the longest single sentence that has ever felt like breathing, where I congratulated them on another year of tradition while thanking them for making the guest list simple by keeping it to people they consider real family. And I said I was glad they finally stopped sending me the obligatory text because it saved us all the effort of pretending, and I wished them a wonderful holiday season and promised That next year, they would not need to worry about whether I would show up because I was officially removing myself from whatever roster they keep in their heads, and I ended by saying I was proud of the life I am building even if it does not match their template, which is not an insult so much as a relief. I hit post and waited for the familiar rush of regret that usually follows any time I say something that puts me outside their circle, and it did not come. What came instead was a quiet steadiness, and then the small fireworks of notifications as cousins started texting me privately with that embarrassed tone people use when they want to be Switzerland, and an aunt tried to call. And my father sent a single line that said we should talk when things cooled down, and while they were busy managing optics, I did the pettiest and purest thing I have allowed myself in a long time, which was to take the photo, download it, and add it to a folder labeled Training Materials for Life. A private archive of reminders about what it costs to keep asking for a chair you will never be offered. And then I did one more thing that felt like a tiny act of revenge, even if it looked like nothing from the outside. I changed the name of the family group in my phone to something that only I could see, a new label that said auditions closed, and I moved the thread to a folder I never open. And I set a filter that sends anything from my mother straight to a separate inbox I check on my terms, because if I cannot control how they categorize me, I can control how I categorize them, and while it does not look dramatic on a screen, I promise you it felt like flipping a switch in a room I have been trapped in for years. And as I sat there in the quiet, I realized I was finally ready to stop asking them to see me, which is when the bigger idea walked in and sat down like it had been waiting its whole life for this exact moment. After I hit post and watched the little storm start in the comments and private messages, I did what I promised myself I would do, which was make some tea, put my phone face down, and try to let the whole thing pass without feeding it. But anyone who has ever been the designated problem in a family knows that even when you choose silence, the noise still finds you, and it found me the way it always does, through a cousin who means well and never quite manages to keep her hands off the drama. I should tell you that the version of me my family carries around in their heads is the one who left home too early, who moved into a cheap apartment in a part of town my mother called sketchy, who took whatever jobs I could grab and then stacked more hours on top because rent does not care about your pride, and that version has been very convenient for them. Because as long as I am the one who never quite figured it out, they get to be the ones who tried their best, so I kept my head down, learned to say less, and poured everything into a little idea that did not look like anything until it did. And I did not bring it to the table at Thanksgiving because I learned that bringing anything to that table is an invitation for someone to make a joke about my projects while they pass the pie. The thing I built started as a service no one was offering in the way regular people actually needed it, and then it became a product that made the service unnecessary. And I would come home late and sit on the floor with my laptop because the desk was still a folding table, and I taught myself the parts one could not afford to hire, and I watched the needle move one quiet notch at a time. And when it finally jumped, I did what most people in my position do, which is absolutely nothing, because you do not celebrate on the first good month, or the first big client, or the first write-up. You keep your head down and see if it holds. By the time it held, the story inside the family had hardened like old concrete, and I had stopped trying to chip at it, so when my cousin Lindsay sent me a string of messages that started with, "Please do not be mad at me, I love you. But I think you should see this," I had that familiar drop in my stomach that happens when someone hands you a truth you already know, and I opened the screenshot expecting to see a snide little aside, maybe a light dig about my post, and what I saw instead was the group text I have never been in, the one with the cheerful name and the matching heart icons, and near the top, right under Megan's note about what time hair and makeup were coming, there was my mother telling everyone not to worry about inviting me because it would make things awkward, and the whole point was to have a peaceful day. I stared at that line so long the screen dimmed, and I toggled it back to life and read it again, and then I scrolled and found an aunt saying she hates how I turn everything into a statement, and my brother tossing in a joke about how I would probably bring a pitch deck to the photo, and the part that hurt most was not the cruelty, because I can armor up against that. It was the casual way they all accepted the premise that excluding me is easier, that my feelings are a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be considered, which is a sentence you do not unsee once it has been written in your family's handwriting. There was a younger version of me who would have typed a long reply about how families do not get to erase members who do not match the brochure, and there is also a version of me who would have said nothing and carried the weight of it into another year of strained smiles. But the version of me who has been building a life that does not rely on their approval opened the chat window that Lindsay had pulled me into by mistake, read the little banner asking if I wanted to join, and clicked yes. Long enough to see the typing bubbles explode into panic, and I wrote one tidy paragraph that said I appreciated the clarity, that I would no longer be available for any event that requires my absence to keep the peace, that they could keep their tradition and I would keep my self-respect, and that the next time they talk about me they should consider doing it in a place where I cannot read it by accident, and then I left the conversation before anyone could perform remorse. It felt like a small thing on the surface, a digital door closing, but inside my chest something level finally settled, and I took 2 screenshots, saved them in a folder labeled receipts, because naming things helps me stay honest with myself. And then I did one more thing that I knew would be both petty and clean, which was to log into the shared photo album account that I pay for because no one ever remembered to reimburse me when we split the bill years ago. Cancel the premium plan with a firm click that returned everyone to the free tier with its lovely little limit, and allow the automatic message to go out informing the family admin, who happens to be Megan, that storage had been reduced and some uploads would be paused until the owner updated payment, because if I am such an inconvenience, then my wallet can stop being so convenient. I put the kettle back on because the first cup had gone cold while I was doing grown-up things like adjusting boundaries and refusing to be polite about being erased. And I stood in my kitchen listening to the old hiss and thought about how many years I spent asking for the smallest form of inclusion, not a parade, not a speech, just a text with a time and a place, and how the absence of that text had finally given me something stronger than rage, which was proof in their own words, and once you have proof, you have options, and once you have options, you start thinking about scale, visibility, and impact. Which is exactly where my mind went when the next message popped up from a number I did not recognize asking for a confirmation on a media inquiry with my name spelled correctly and the publication spelled in a way that makes older relatives sit up straighter. And in that moment the idea that had been circling the edge of my mind clicked into focus so completely it almost made me laugh. The message that landed in my inbox the following morning was not from a cousin or an aunt scrambling to control the fallout. It was from a journalist whose name I recognized, because I had been reading his work for years in a publication that my family treated like scripture whenever they wanted to measure who in the neighborhood was really doing something with their life, and the email was short and professional, asking for a few clarifications before the piece went live, and that was when I realized that what had felt like a private climb, a slow crawl in the shadows where no one bothered to look, was about to become very public in a way that not even my family's practiced silence could erase. I sat there rereading the draft he had attached, and line after line I could hear the sharp edge of irony, because here was this clean little biography of me, written by someone who had never met my mother or eaten pie at my grandmother's table. And yet he somehow managed to see me more clearly than the people who raised me, and when I saw the headline, my name attached to a list that carried weight far beyond the usual dinner table bragging rights, I felt something close to vindication, though I would not have admitted it out loud, because pride is one of those emotions that always came back to haunt me when I tried to express it at home. For a few hours I carried it quietly, not because I was trying to be humble, but because I wanted to savor the feeling of being recognized on a stage that my family could not control, and I imagined how the group text would light up when they saw it, how they would try to downplay it or twist it into another reason why I was distant, and for the first time in years I found myself smiling at the thought of them scrambling, because no amount of curated holiday photos could compete with the validation of an institution they respected far more than they ever respected me. Still, I am not going to pretend it was simple, because when you grow up being told in 100 subtle ways that you are too much, too loud, too complicated, too ambitious, you carry the weight of those labels even when the world starts calling you something different, and part of me wondered whether using my success as a weapon against them made me petty, but then I remembered the screenshots, the message about my presence making things awkward, and I realized that what I was planning was not cruelty, It was balance. It was a correction to years of being erased, and if it happened to sting, then maybe they would finally understand what it felt like to be on the other side of exclusion. The idea that had been circling the edges of my mind since the moment I read that text thread finally stepped into focus so sharp it made my breath catch, because it was not enough for them to read about me, not enough for them to see a link someone forwarded. I wanted them to be confronted with me in a way they could not click past, and the image that arrived in my head was so audacious, so perfectly tailored to their obsession with appearances, that I laughed out loud in my empty kitchen. I thought about my grandmother's house, the one with the big window in the front that she loved to dress with curtains depending on the season, the same window that framed so many of the family photos I was never asked to join. And I thought about the empty patch of space across the street that had always carried some kind of billboard, sometimes for local politicians, sometimes for cheap furniture sales. And I realized with a kind of thrilling certainty that the universe had handed me a stage. Directly in her line of sight, a stage I could buy for a month if I wanted to, and for the first time in my life I felt what it might be like to have the upper hand in a family that had always enjoyed keeping me small. Once the thought landed, it would not leave. And I spent the rest of that day toggling between nerves and adrenaline, telling myself it was ridiculous, telling myself it was childish, then remembering how many times I had been treated like a child by people who still thought of me as the one who never figured it out, and I decided that maybe giving them a reminder in giant block letters would be the cleanest way to close the loop. So I pulled up the contact page for the outdoor advertising company that handled placements in my grandmother's neighborhood, typed out an inquiry, hesitated long enough to feel the weight of what I was about to do, and then hit send. And when the automated reply landed in my inbox a moment later, confirming that a representative would call me the next morning, I felt the strange calm that comes when a decision has finally been made. I went to bed that night with my phone on the pillow next to me, not because I needed comfort, but because I wanted to remember that there was a time when I waited for texts from people who had no intention of sending them. And now I was the one setting the terms of who would see what, when, and how, and as I drifted off to sleep I realized that the breaking point had come and gone, and the only thing left to do was follow through. The call came right on time the next morning, and when I picked up and heard the cheerful voice of the representative from the advertising company introducing himself, I almost laughed at how surreal it felt to be talking so casually about something that, at least in my mind, carried the weight of decades of exclusion, because while to him it was just another potential booking on a busy calendar, for me it was the culmination of years of being erased from family photos, conversations, and memories, and the irony of explaining my request in the same tone someone might use to order a pizza was not lost on me. I told him I was interested in a very specific location, the one directly across from a residential property on Maplewood Avenue, and he tapped at his keyboard for a moment before confirming that, yes, the slot was available for the coming month. And yes, I could book it with just a deposit and a simple design file. My voice was steady as I asked him about dimensions, deadlines, and costs, and all the while my mind was racing ahead, picturing the moment when the curtains in my grandmother's living room would be pulled back and she would see the one message she had spent years trying not to hear. After the call ended, I sat staring at my laptop, the specifications for the billboard glowing back at me in black and white, and for a moment I let myself think about the ridiculousness of what I was planning. Because it is not every day that a family dispute escalates to the level of public advertising, and part of me wondered if I was stepping into a territory that would make me look unhinged rather than triumphant. But then I remembered the years of group texts that went out without my name, the way my sister once said, without irony, that it was just easier to take one less photo when I was not around. And the screenshot from my mother dismissing me as an obstacle to peace, and suddenly the idea of buying a billboard felt less like a stunt and more like a kind of long-delayed justice, a balancing of scales that had been tilted for far too long. I spent that afternoon drafting and redrafting the message in a plain text file, trying different phrasings, because if I was going to take this step it had to be sharp, undeniable, and impossible to twist into something that diminished me. After a dozen variations, I landed on the one line that carried exactly the weight I wanted. Guess who just made Forbes? It was short, It was clean, and it carried a sting that required no explanation, because the name of that list was a language my family spoke fluently, and they could never argue that it was a coincidence or an exaggeration. I added my name in smaller print beneath it, not out of humility, but because I wanted the punch to land in sequence, the question first, the undeniable answer second, and once I had the mock-up in front of me, I knew it was perfect. Still, even as I sent the file off to the design department and transferred the deposit, I felt the waves of doubt that come whenever you step out of the role your family has assigned you, and I heard the phantom voices telling me I was dramatic, petty, embarrassing, all the things they had said to keep me in line. For a few hours, I let those voices swirl, and then I silenced them by pulling out the receipts folder I had started keeping, scrolling through the screenshots, and reminding myself that these were not inventions of my imagination, but their actual words, their actual choices, and if they wanted to avoid the consequences, they should have considered that before reducing me to a problem best handled through exclusion. The following days were a blur of logistics, because revenge is not just about emotion, it is about execution, and I found myself going over proofs, confirming color balances, and signing digital approvals with the same precision I once applied to building my business, which made me laugh when I thought about it, because in its own way this billboard had become a kind of startup too, a project that began with an idea, grew into a plan, and demanded commitment until it was real enough to touch. And with every step I completed, I felt the strange satisfaction of turning their silence into a stage, their dismissal into fuel, and my own long-suppressed fury into something that would tower above them in letters too large to ignore. When the final confirmation email arrived telling me the installation would go up on Monday morning, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in years I felt not just vindicated but exhilarated. Because this was not about asking for a seat at their table anymore. This was about building a table so large they could not look away, and if the cost of that was a little embarrassment, then maybe embarrassment was exactly the medicine they had earned. And as I went to bed that night, I realized that the countdown had begun, not to another family gathering where I would wait for a text that never came, but to the moment when every single one of them would have to face the truth in 10-foot letters staring directly through the window they once used as a frame for a family portrait that never included me. The morning the installation crew confirmed placement, I made a deliberate choice not to stand on the sidewalk across from my grandmother's house like some vigilante waiting for a curtain twitch, because I wanted the message to do the talking without my shadow anywhere near it, so I took myself to a coffee shop a few blocks away, opened my laptop to clear out ordinary emails like a person running a life that does not orbit around one family's moods, and when the proof photo from the advertising rep arrived with a cheerful line about successful deployment, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding and stared at the words I had chosen, simple and pointed and impossible to misinterpret, sitting on a canvas that no one in my family could minimize or crop or pretend they did not see. The first ping came from an unknown number that turned out to be my cousin Hannah asking if this was real and whether I understood how upset Grandma would be, followed by my sister Megan dropping a long paragraph in the family group thread about how I had crossed a line and made the neighborhood gossip machine spin, then my brother Tyler with his practiced lightness asking if I was planning a second act, and tucked between them a private text from my father saying he wished we could have handled this quietly while acknowledging that the message looked very professional, which is the sort of backhanded diplomacy he thinks counts as care, and finally, sitting like a stone in my notifications, a voicemail from my mother that was all sighs and disappointment about propriety and dignity and how I had embarrassed people who love me, as if the billboard had invented the exclusion rather than reflected it back at scale. I listened to my grandmother's voicemail twice because I needed to be sure I was hearing what I was hearing, which was not concern for me or curiosity about the work that had placed my name in a publication she clipped for her scrapbook when neighbors' kids made the local business page, but a tidy little lecture about respect for elders and family traditions. And in the space between her pauses I could feel the old script unrolling, the one where my feelings are inconveniences and my achievements are manageable so long as they do not demand attention, and I realized that if I called back in that moment I would be pulled into a familiar performance where I soothed the discomfort of the people who created it, So instead, I wrote one measured message and sent it to the group with deliberate calm, telling them that I was done arguing about whether I deserved a place in my own family narrative, that the billboard was not a tantrum, but an answer to years of silence, that I was open. 2. Individual conversations where accountability was not treated like cruelty, and that I would no longer attend any gathering whose definition of peace required my absence. Then I did the part no one in that thread expected because they have always underestimated me, which was to keep the focus off the fight and on the future by triggering the second step I had planned in case the day arrived, and I felt the wobble that any human feels after detonating a boundary. And that step was not another splashy stunt, but a measured act with a long tail, a small scholarship fund filed under a name that tells the truth in plain language, a fund intended for one young person, each year whose own family has turned them into an afterthought, seated with money I had set aside the day the journalist told me the piece was scheduled, folded into a landing page that went live alongside the article, and mentioned in a line at the bottom of the Billboard artwork because I wanted the triumph to point beyond my own bruised history. The publication hit right on schedule, and the calls shifted from scolding to stunned congratulations that sounded like people reading from a script they found on the floor. And when a neighbor of my grandmother's, a woman who used to pinch my cheek and ask when I was going to do something practical, texted to say she had never seen Rose this quiet, I felt the strangest mix of sorrow and relief, because quiet was the one thing I had never been allowed to have in that house unless I was invisible. And now the quiet belonged to them, and I did not need to fill it with apologies. In the afternoon, my father asked me to meet at a diner to talk things through, and I told him that for once I would not be attending a family summit designed to reframe my actions as a problem to be solved, but that I would gladly have coffee with him alone on another day if the agenda was honest acknowledgement rather than optics management. And when he stalled, I let the pause stand because I have learned that rescuing people from their own discomfort is a habit I can retire. By evening, the group thread had turned into a performance of concern about my mental health, as if the only possible explanation for a woman asserting herself was that she must be unstable. And rather than feeding it, I set a final note that said I was moving the conversation to one-on-one channels, and then I archived the thread, not as a dramatic flourish, but as a practical step toward the life I am living, where the people who want access to me have to show up as individuals rather than a chorus, and where my boundaries are not open to a vote. Before I slept, I drove by Maplewood, not to gloat, but to verify that reality matched the photo, and from the corner at the end of the block I saw enough to know that it did, the message holding its ground without me. And I felt an unexpected steadiness settle in, because while the billboard will come down and the article will move to an archive, the part that does not expire is the shift inside me that says I do not ask anymore, I do not beg to be let in. I decide what counts as family by how people behave, and if anyone wants to test whether I meant it, they can look out a certain window and be reminded that I did not whisper the truth. I hung it where everyone could see it, and then I went home and slept without waiting for a text that never comes.